Bryan Caplan is professor of economics at George Mason University, a New York Times best-selling author with a BA in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in economics from Princeton. Christopher Freiman is professor at the John Chambers College of Business and Economics at West Virginia. Chris is an graduate of Duke University with a BA in philosophy and received his MA and PhD in philosophy from the University of Arizona. Chris is the author of several books on philosophy, but none of them made the New York Times bestseller list. We won't make that the criteria for deciding who wins today's argument. We're going to start off with about 10 minutes for you to lay out your basic position. And as Chris is sort of advocating, we make a change from the status quo. I'm going to ask Chris to take the first 10 minutes and tell us why he thinks moving to a universal basic income would be a good idea. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. And thanks to ILS for hosting this. Also, thanks to Brian for taking the time to discuss this with me. And I have to apologize in advance if you hear my dog barking in the background. But so just to clarify, to reiterate a point up front. So my position here, again, is that moving to a UBI would be an improvement over the status quo. I think there's an interesting discussion to be had about whether a UBI is the best kind of redistributive system we could have. I don't know if I have strong opinions on that, but I do think it's better than what we currently have. And so one thing then to bear in mind is that even if your kind of taxation is theft, sort of libertarian, that's a given. So you're getting taxed either way. The question is, do you want to be taxed for the status quo or do you want to be taxed for UBI? So with that being said, I think maybe the simple case for a UBI starts by looking at people who would be receiving the UBI. So I think recipients are better off under a UBI than they are under the status quo. The idea here is very simple, but I think it's a powerful thought. So consider just a very simple analogy. Suppose your boss comes to you and says, "Oh, we've had a banner year. I'm thinking about giving out bonuses to all of the employees, including you. But there are two options on the table. One is I can take that money and buy you lunch every single work day of the year, or I can just give you the cash equivalent." I think in that case, it's pretty clear that you would want the cash equivalent. Why? Well, if it turns out that what you value more than anything else you could buy with that money is lunch, then you can use the cash to buy the lunch. If it turns out that there are things that you value more highly than the lunch, then you can use the cash to buy those things, whatever they happen to be. So you're not going to be worse off as a result of having cash in that scenario, and you're very likely better off. And I think this same sort of argument translates to the case for a UBI. So you could have the particular bundle of benefits that Washington, D.C. wants to give you. Or again, if you're a recipient, you could just get the cash equivalent. And if you want to buy the bundle, parts of the bundle, that's fine. You could do it. That's what the cash is for. But if it turns out that you would prefer a different bundle, you prefer to start a business, invest, whatever, you're also able to do that. So from the recipient's point of view, you're not worse off as a result of getting cash, and you're very likely to be better off, at least in a lot of cases. And so I think this is sort of a general sort of friendly libertarian point here, which is that you know your particular circumstances better than other people do. And so you will be better equipped to use resources to advance your own interests and to know what resources you need than Washington, D.C. does. So better to give people the cash. They can evaluate their particular needs, their particular circumstances, use the cash to advance their own interests. And again, if it just turns out that you happen to value the bundle of goods and services that the state provides under the status quo, you'll be able to buy that bundle with the cash if you so prefer. So that's sort of the first point. From the perspective of recipients, it's a good deal. You're not going to be worse off as a recipient. What about taxpayers? So do taxpayers have a complaint against moving from the status quo to a UBI? I imagine this is something we'll get into a little bit later on, but from my perspective, the answer is no. So here again, we're just assuming, let's say the taxes are going to stay the same. So I'm not going to advocate for increasing taxes to fund a particular UBI. I'm going to say, let's take the current welfare state that we have, the current transfer spending that we have, and just convert that to a UBI. And so, from the perspective of the taxpayers, you're not worse off. You're still paying the same amount that you otherwise would. It's just being delivered to people in the form of cash rather than in kind benefits. So taxpayers not worse off, recipients very likely better off. So that's my very quick pitch for the UBI. But let me say a couple of additional things before you move on. So one big issue is, well, how big is this UBI going to be? How much could we actually get by converting the status quo to a UBI? And it depends on what parts of the status quo you're willing to give up. As far as I can tell, I think the most radical proposal, and I think the one that I'm probably most sympathetic to, says you could basically replace all transfer spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, et cetera, so on down the line. So this is Charles Murray's proposal, and get about $13,000 per American adult. And maybe we say, maybe there's some parts of the status quo that we wouldn't want to convert to a UBI, but things like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, I think, are fair game. And so that's a pretty healthy amount. So 13,000 per American adult. Again, maybe we want to keep certain things that are directed specifically for children, but I actually think that's a pretty good deal. That's a pretty healthy amount of money. Maybe it's too much. Maybe we could talk about that. Maybe that's too much money. The perverse incentives will be a big problem. That's something to discuss. But I don't think the UBI being too small is a big problem. One other issue I think that's worth clarifying is this thought that, well, there's something unfair about a UBI where, Elon Musk gets a check for $13,000 every year. That seems really unfair. I would say, yeah, at first blush, that seems unfair, but that's actually not how we would have to implement a UBI. Well, so he would get the $13,000 a year, but he's not getting $13,000 a year on net. So the idea is that he is paying more than the $13,000 per year to fund the UBI. So he's still a net contributor under those circumstances. And so a number of people have pointed out that you can configure the tax end in such a way that a UBI is functionally equivalent to something like a negative income tax. So I think I think that's my short pitch, and we can get into the back and forth in a bit. But let me hand it over to Bryan at this point.
All right, thank you very much. So Chris has the reasonable libertarian view of what we should do here. Unfortunately, it turns out that when you push a little bit harder, you realize that it's actually going to be a very bad and costly approach. So Chris does have this thought experiment where you could either go and give everybody lunch or just give them the cash. Wouldn't you want to just give them the cash? Just to start, there is a very good reason why almost no welfare state does this, which is that in reality, we're often concerned about the kids in poor families, and we don't really want to help the parents that much. And then the concern is, well, if we go and just give them the cash, the parents might not actually spend it on the kids. If you give it in the form of food stamps or education, then it's going to be pretty hard for the parent to go and sell the kids' seed in the school on the black market in order to get money for alcohol. Whereas if you do it in kind, then it is much easier to go and actually get it to the people that you want, when the people that you want to help, in fact, are not able-bodied adults and don't know what in the world is going on. So that is the big reason to not give cash. I noticed that the Institute for Liberal Studies is handing out mailing out free books to Canadians. Why not just go mail them checks for the price of the book? And the answer is you don't want them to have that. You want them to have the book, because it isn't just about making the recipient personally better off. It's about achieving a broader end. Now, in this case, I assume the broader end is freeing Canada, right? One step at a time. Well, this book is the first step on this great plan for freeing Canada. I like Matt's book, by the way, but I don't think it is a very good step on the way to freeing Canada. I think ultimately it is a small step on the way to making Canada less free. But in any case, if you can understand why you want to send out books rather than checks to people, you can understand why you would want to actually have in-kind welfare benefits rather than cash benefits. Even if, as Chris says, if you accept the full taxation as theft critique, Still, you can say, well, taxation's theft, but theft for the purpose of feeding hungry kids seems a lot less objectionable than theft for the purpose of just giving people money so they can do whatever the hell they want. So that is the big case for actually saying that in-kind benefits are a good idea. Let's see. Seems like someone is coming up on screen who shouldn't come on screen, but I will just proceed. Now, in terms of the practical issue, it really does come down to arithmetic. So Chris has this $13,000 figure, right? This is one where that is at the extreme high end. That does come from getting rid of every program, including the most popular programs in the entire world: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Once again, in terms of understanding why those medical programs are extremely unlikely to ever be abolished and why people don't want to, is that these are programs that fund for healthcare, which for most people they pay zero or close to it, but then for a few people they're paying a lot. In Charles Murray's version, you were required to take some of your UBI and buy a health insurance policy, right? And again, why is that? Well, it really comes down to, we know that a lot of people will not go and buy the health insurance policy because they actually value the money more than the policy. But then some of them will get really sick. They'll be at the hospital. And then the question is, who's going to go and pay for their emergency appendicitis or whatever, right? The current welfare state is centered around, we are too weak to turn people down when they make bad decisions or when they just have bad luck. And so we're going to go and give them the in-kind payment. But all that aside, when you're doing the math here, let's see, one other thing. So now, out of people that have really crunched the numbers in a more realistic way, especially from a libertarian point of view, there's economist Ed Dolan. So he goes through and says, all right, look, we're not going to go and get rid of Medicaid because we're not going to go and turn people down at the hospital when they haven't bought health insurance. We're not going to go and take away people's Social Security payments because that $13,000 compared to what you're getting from Social Security is, for most, or at least many people, is a pittance. They'd be getting a way better deal than that on Social Security than they currently are. But he goes through and he finds that you could do $3,000 a year per person, right? $3,000 a year, which is a lot less. But probably the best way to understand the arithmetic of the UBI is this, right? Just ask people, right? So what do you think is a reasonable payment? And then what do you think is the clawback rate? Because like Chris says, for Elon, we're going to go and take some of it back from him, right? Okay, so let's just go and make the math easy. Let's say, all right, let's give everybody $10,000 a year. All right, fine. And then what about the clawback rate? So at what rate will we go and reduce your benefits if we, if you start earning? So a lot of people say, oh, like, fine, 25%. All right, great. So if we now go back to some 7th grade math, so all right, so family of 4 will be getting $40,000. Then ask yourself, so how much money do you have to earn with a 25% marginal benefit reduction rate before your family finally becomes net taxpayers? And the answer is $160,000 in family income. And that is for a UBI that actually seems pretty low to most people, and for a clawback rate that seems fairly high to most people. If you do something that people like better, like let's give $20,000 per year per person, then for a family of 4, and then if you also say, let's go and have only a 20% clawback rate, then we are talking about families don't start on net paying taxes until their income exceeds 80,000 times 5. So we're talking, let's see, we're talking $400,000. So this means we're putting the entire tax burden of the system on families with income higher than $400,000. That's more extreme progressive taxation than Sweden ever had at the peak. Now you're saying, like, well, gee, why is it costing so much? What is happening? And the answer is that the current system saves a pile of money by just saying that a lot of people are not eligible regardless of what happens. So, how is that? Well, so they said, look, if it's not just that we means test purely upon income, it's also upon position in life. So right now, college student has very little income, but guess what? They either have to go and get a job or their parents are going to support them. So in general, when you do what the whole idea of the universal basic income is, remember, it's called universal. I'm a little surprised Chris didn't talk about this more. The fact that it's universal means everybody's eligible. And right now, there's just a lot of people that we just throw off. So especially in the US, it's super hard for a non-custodial adult to go on welfare. So if you've got a kid, then yeah, you can do it, right? If you're the primary caregiver for a child, then you can go and start getting a lot of government money. But if you are a healthy, able-bodied adult who doesn't have kids, or you are not the primary caregiver for those kids, then no matter how desperate you are, in at least a lot of US states, you basically are very limited how much money you can get. The idea of the universal basic income is precisely to take all those people and say, no, no, you get the benefits too. I remember when I was debating Will Wilkinson on this before an audience of college students, he went and snarked on them. Look, all of you college kids, all upper middle class, have your UBI already from your parents. I just want to go and give it to everybody. And I said, all right, well, some of you might actually have that. But if your parents are anything like my parents, if you just say, hey, here's my plan, I'm not going to work, I'm not going to go to school, I'm just going to sponge off my family for the rest of my life, your parents would say, no, there are expectations here, and you don't get supported just because you don't feel like doing anything. You have to go and hold up your end in order to go and get the support. That's the way my parents are. That's the way I am with my kids. And that is the way that the current system winds up saving a pile of money, is by having a lot of additional eligibility requirements to thin the herd of people that are eligible for money. Now, Chris started this with this thought experiment about if you could either get the cash or lunch, which one would you want? So I'll end with a very similar thought experiment, which I think honestly is just completely devastating to the UBI. Right, so you're probably familiar with effective altruism, the idea that when you give to charity, you should go and try to get the most bang for your buck. Well, consider this. Suppose you're really rich and you've got $8 billion to give away. How are you going to do it? The universal basic income approach really would be to say, I'm going to give $1 to every person on earth. I got to say, that is one of the dumbest ways to give money away that you could possibly imagine. The only dumber thing is to give it to Harvard, right? Just to overstate the situation. Now, if you had $8 billion, go and target it. Go and find the war orphans that no one else is taking care of. Give them the $8 billion. Give people who are not going to have a substantial response in supply, but also just the people who really desperately need it the most, will do the most good. Universal basic income essentially throws that away, which I think why, when you go to actual quantitative economists, no matter how left wing, it's very hard to find any that support the universal basic income, because they realize that it really is a lot like going and giving $1 to every person on earth. You're wasting most of your money on people who don't need it. It's true, of course, there's also some taxes, so it's not like the net is that Elon will be getting a lot of money. But the point is, you can conceptually say, all right, first of all, we've got the taxes, which give us a pool of money, whatever that is. And then step two is, how do we spend it? And what the UBI answer is, we spend it by giving equal amounts to every adult, or maybe every person in the country. And that, I say, is just absolute madness. Don't do it. It's way worse than the status quo.
Thank you, Brian. We'll go back to Chris now for about 5 minutes to in response to Brian.
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't know, like on the giving out books for gifts, isn't the line from Economist that you shouldn't even give gifts, right? Or you should give cash. So I don't, like, that's how I've been doing it. You just give cash.
Right.
Don't give out birthday gifts or anything.
Sorry, can we interrupt each other, or should
Sure.
I
I
just?
mean, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. There's the externalities. There's the effects that you're actually trying to achieve. The Institute for Liberal Studies is not trying to go and raise the living standards of the recipient of the book. At least I don't think so. The goal is to, in the long run, go and improve the political environment in Canada. And so you give the thing that's going to do that. Giving the money is not going to accomplish the actual goal of the think tank, whereas going and handing out the ideas, even if you'd rather have the cash, is.
Yeah, that's fair. But so a couple of thoughts. So one just preliminary point is, I think there's a distinction worth drawing between the question of the desirability of replacing the status quo with the UBI as opposed to the feasibility.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm inclined to agree. There are lots of reasons. I mean, take Social Security, for example. So I think Dolan's proposal is that people who are eligible for Social Security get the option of keeping it.
Yes.
And so, I mean, there's a reason they call Social Security the third rail of American politics. You can't touch it and survive. It's untouchable. And so, I think that's a fair point. I think that's a fair point against the claim that anytime soon we could expect to get a UBI as a replacement. But my concern is more, would it be good if we could make that happen? Although I'm fully aware that there are lots of reasons why it would be a very, very difficult fight to make that happen. But that's also, I think, part of where I part ways with someone like Dolan. I would say, look, I mean, maybe we have some sort of temporary program where if you're eligible for Social Security, you get some limited period of time where you can access that. But over time, if it were up to me, and the question again is just, is the UBI an improvement over the status quo? I would say Social Security is going as well. And I think that's actually good. I mean, so I think the average American is going to be much better off as a result of having cash as opposed to having Social Security. So you start getting this, 21 or whatever the cutoff is, and then you can start actually investing that in retirement savings. It's going to be much, much richer as a result of having cash that you can invest in private retirement as opposed to relying on Social Security. So I think that would be an upgrade for most Americans. And yeah, so some thoughts on targeting and kids. So I mean, so I agree with you that the effective altruist should not just give a dollar bill to everyone on Earth. They should donate it to the Against Malaria Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
But the U.S. government is not so much like the Against Malaria Foundation. So there are these cases where there are government programs, of course, that benefit kids, benefit people who really, really need the help. But there's also a lot in the status quo that does not do that. So a lot of it is age-based, for example. So here again, it's sort of a matter of weighing up the costs and benefits. So like Social Security, for example, that's age-based, for example, rather than helping kids directly. And that's the biggest part of the sort of status quo would be Social Security. Also, in terms of the kid point, so I think you raise a fair worry about someone who has obligations to children just spending their UBI money on something other than their child's education or their child's food. But I actually think to some extent I mean, it would be an overstatement to say it's orthogonal to the debate, but forget the UBI for a second. So suppose you have somebody who just earns $100,000 a year, labor market income. Let's say they don't actually receive any sort of redistributive transfers. If they didn't send their kid to school, or if they didn't provide food for their kid, they would be breaking the law. So the incentive for that person who is not the recipient of any redistributive transfers to make sure that their kid is taken care of is, I mean, the incentive in this case would be, I will be, fined, imprisoned, whatever, if I don't use my resources to take care of my kids. So it seems to me that mechanism is going to be adequate in the case of a UBI. So you have someone who receives the cash and is tempted to not feed their kids adequately. Well, that would be a violation of the law. It would be a violation of their parental duties. So I don't think this concern for kids speaks decisively against a UBI, because I think we could get a lot of what we want by just requiring parents to take care of their kids in the way that we already do. Do I have any more time, or should I could punt it over, I guess?
You can go for another minute or two if you like, Chris.
Okay. And yeah, so one other, so I guess I could talk briefly about this idea of having sort of eligibility requirements. So that point is well taken, but one issue that arises with some of these eligibility requirements is they impose administrative burdens on potential recipients. So people who would otherwise be eligible for these benefits might have trouble accessing them. And certain sorts of income requirements can also create benefit cliffs, which are, create perverse incentives for people. So you say, look, if I actually earn more income on the labor market, my benefit gets cut back. And so you don't have that issue with the UBI. So there definitely is this incentive worry about a UBI. The person who's going to just take the check and go surfing all day. I think that is a real worry. But I think there are also worries about the incentives that arise under the status quo, where you do have these benefit cliffs, where people actually get a bad deal by re-entering the labor market. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Bryan, over to you for about 5 minutes to respond.
Sure. Let's talk a bit more about disincentive effects. So now Chris has a seemingly pretty strong commitment to, we're not going to raise any taxes, right? So in that case, you can say, well, if we go and have this UBI, what's going to happen is that there'll be a lot more people who'll be getting a smaller amount. So instead of going and spending most of our money on Social Security, we'll be spreading around. And just realistically, though, the main issue is that all actual UBIs do require much higher taxes in order to get to any level that people consider remotely acceptable. So like I was saying, if you're just going through the math, if you like, it was not going to be feasible to put the entire tax burden on families with over $400,000 in income. And notice that's assuming that the only cost of government is the UBI. Right? So we would actually need to be putting way more burden upon a very tiny number of people, which is ultimately more progressive than any country that I've ever even heard of, at least that has had a normal tax system rather than just expropriating people. So the main issue with the UBI is precisely by making a lot more people eligible, you need to have much higher taxes to pay for it. This is not Chris's UBI. It's just all actual UBIs that could ever possibly happen. And that means that while there is this benefit of you get rid of these benefit cliffs, but on the other hand, you have the issue of the overall tax rate has to be a lot higher. And so the actual effect on work effort is at minimum not so clear. But when you look at the actual magnitudes we're talking about, I think there's just very little doubt that the work disincentives are much worse. Charles Murray, in his version, has a funny what's the right, like, he's got a funny formula where it's like you have to be 21 to get the UBI. So not even, so no, your kids don't get it because he's worried about encouraging more non-marital births, but actually 18-year-olds don't get it either. You got 3 years. He's like, look, if we give it to 18-year-olds, then they might just go and move in with 3 friends to the beach and just start having a big party. But if they have 3 years where they're not getting the money, that's their formative period. Well, they'll get their lives in order. And my reply to that is, look, you're thinking that the only way that work disincentives actually matter is when someone just says, hey, like, I just find it way better to not work and get the money. But what about the one where you're 21 and you're just having trouble finding a job? And it's like, well, I could either go and keep looking and struggling and suffering, or I could just give up. Or alternately, you might get a job and then you get laid off when you're 23. And it's like, well, okay, I gave it a shot. And now I can go and revert back to plan A. And I think that is another very likely scenario. Now, further in terms of work incentives, there's another way. I'm just going to stand up for the status quo and say it's not as dumb as it could be. Namely, since we go and we heavily base money upon age for both the young and the old, well, guess which 2 groups are very unlikely to change their work behavior in response to stronger incentives? Yeah, you got it, the young and the old. Even if kids, if you give a lot of money to kids, this isn't going to cause many of them to say, well, I was going to get a job at 10, but now I won't. So we don't have much in the way of work incentives for kids. So during COVID, you might have noticed that there was a sudden increase in the share of young people working, which is interesting because it's been going down for ages. But same thing for the elderly. Like if you're 75, then it is pretty likely you're not going to have a job with or without benefits, unless you were on the absolute edge of starvation. So the current system actually, maybe accidentally, although probably with a bit of common sense, winds up saying, well, we're going to go and not give the money to working age people because guess what? They could work. So if they want money, let them work. And we're going to take the money that would have been very small an amount if we gave it to everybody, regardless of age. And we are going to take the money that would have gone to people that are perfectly able to take care of themselves. And we're going to go and take a lot of it and give it to kids, and the rest of it, and we're going to give it to the elderly. And we don't have to worry much about the disincentives because the very young, the very old probably would have barely worked anyway. So that there is that. Now, on Chris's point about how we could just go and very strictly enforce child neglect laws and so on in order to make sure that kids are getting their proper share, here's the important thing to understand. When you begin with a parent that's earning $100,000, well, so a person like that actually has a lot to lose, and threats from the government to go and take their kids away or punish them harshly mean a lot, and they're very scary. And so you're probably not going to, they're very mild threats are going to get them to do the right thing. Or honestly, if you're responsible enough to be holding down a job making $100,000, there's probably just no issue of you taking care of your kids adequately. On the other hand, if you have someone who is otherwise unemployed, then the threat to go and have child services bother you or take your kids away from you is just not that scary. It's one where you just don't have that much to lose. And so the government has to really actually be very draconian in order to get results out of you, because you're just not that scared because of what's going on. A way I like to think about it is, if you think about sending a violent criminal to a minimum security prison as a deterrent. Yeah, well, that guy's probably not going to be very deterred by that. He'll just say, hey, it's Camp Cupcake. What do I care? No big deal. It's the easiest piece of time ever done. But threaten to send, say, me or Chris to a minimum security prison, and we will be hiring and pulling out all the stops and mortgaging our houses to avoid it, because for us, that is a huge step down. I think the same thing is going on with the welfare state. A lot of this is motivated by we've got people that have kids who would not do a very good job by their kids. At least we don't have much confidence in them. Maybe some would, some wouldn't, but maybe a third would actually be spending the money on alcohol and drugs if we just gave it as cash. And we're nervous about that. So we're going to go and give it in the form of food stamps, knowing, yeah, it is possible to trade your food stamps for drugs, but it's hard, it's a pain in the neck. So most estimates say that it's only a very small amount of food stamps are not spent on food. I mean, obviously, the parent could go and buy a pile of food and then just stuff their faces with it. But that is a lot less likely to stuff your face and let your kid starve than to go and spend it on alcohol or something else that is not really helping the person that taxpayers are reasonably concerned with. So let's see. I had a list of other things. Let me just go through them quickly. Matt was mentioning the point about not being worse off. That's only if we have something like Ed Dolan's, where you have a choice of either sticking with status quo or doing the UBI. But obviously, we are going to be doing something that is really bad for even middle-class Social Security recipients. So just keep that in mind. So those people are definitely not going to be better off. They're going to be getting a large reduction in cash. So keep that in mind. Let's see here. Let's see. Again, the assumption the taxes stay the same. If Chris wants to hold with that, that's fine. But it does mean either you have to get rid of a very long list of super popular programs, or you have to settle for the UBI being really small at a point where saying, it seems like people probably will be starving on the streets if they've got a bunch of kids, and that's the formula. Let's see here. Yes, it is worth repeating that there's almost no empirical economist, no matter how left-wing, that thinks the UBI is a good idea. Philosophically, I think they like it, but they crunch the math. So Jason Furman, who was head of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, debated on it. And yeah, they were able to scare up some people to do favor it. So there always are some people that are just, there's enough diversity of opinion, you can find someone, but out of almost any normal, quantitatively able left-wing economist, it's really hard to find anyone that supports this idea. And I think with very good reason, because the math just doesn't work unless you do something so extreme that it would have enormous other kinds of blowback. Let's see. Oh, yes. Just one last thing. So I've debated this a whole bunch of times. Normally, my opponents just refuse to go and even answer the question of how we're going to pay for this. Oh, we can totally afford it. So Chris is not doing that. Very good for Chris. The one person I ever debated who had a really solid answer, though, was the head of the editor of the journal Basic Income. There's a whole academic journal entirely devoted to this topic, if you can believe it. And if I remember correctly, he just said, yeah, well, we're just going to have 70% tax rates, 70% marginal tax rates. And for then, the math worked. Right. But for him, it was just like, yeah, well, what's the big deal? It's just 70%. Like you still got 30% left. And it's like, you do realize that for almost everybody, even people who are very left wing, 70% tax rate sounds crazy. And he's like, what? So yeah, if you are in a bubble so redistributionist that 70% is fine, then this idea, the math could work. But otherwise, I think that it is just really ridiculous. And for libertarians to be pushing it at a time when it seems like budget deficits have gotten to be quite serious, and where there's no plan for turning it back, we really need to be talking about cutting, and really holding lines like not one more dime, not for anything, for any reason. I don't. There's the classic Nozick thought experiment of attaching a dime to save the planet from an asteroid. This is the point. It's like I don't know. If we can spare the dime. Sorry. All right, I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thanks to you both. As I mentioned, we'll be going into questions from the audience now. I've got a lot here. We'll try to get through as many as we can. And you can ask them in two ways. One is you can raise your hand in the way that Barry has. Another is you can put it in the chat. I will do my best to sort of follow through those. I've actually picked one from the chat that I think was a good one. We're going to start off with that. And it's a sort of situation I've found myself in, which is I sort of like the idea in theory, of a UBI as a big swap. And sometimes I talk to people who are more on the political left, and I say, yeah, we'll get rid of a lot of other things if we had a UBI. And they say, well, no, I'm not sure I'm ready to get rid of, say, universal health care on the theory that UBI gives people money to buy health care and health insurance. And so it falls apart there. And so this question is directed to Chris, whether Chris thinks there's any mechanism that would stop, even if we got rid of all those programs, would they be reintroduced? Would we end up with both the UBI and something similar to the status quo?
I think that's an excellent worry. So this goes back to the distinction between desirability and feasibility. So my view is that it would be desirable if we could replace the status quo with a UBI. And that does mean cutting all of those popular programs. But I should also say, I don't know how bothered libertarians should be by this, because we're unpopular. Like, all of our policies are unpopular. So like, if we can't advocate for unpopular policies, we're doomed. We're doomed. But so this is a question about feasibility, which is, suppose I snapped my fingers and we got the UBI to replace the status quo tomorrow. Some elements of the status quo I could see start coming back. And I think actually, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is part of why Milton Friedman at one point stopped advocating for a negative income tax, because he said, look, I still like the idea, but I know it's just going to be layered on top of other stuff. And I don't want that. So to use Brian's case, I don't want to tax more dimes. I want to reallocate the dimes that are already being taxed. But in the real world, I do think there's this concern. And actually, I see Adam Martin I don't want to put him on the spot. But he has this great piece with Pete Bedke on this, where he says, look, you could start out with a nice UBI, and then you have these sort of public choice considerations, and it's going to expand pretty rapidly. I think that's a fair point. Here again, I guess all I can say is I would say all libertarians are partners in guilt here, though, because I think you could have the minimal Nozikian state, you could have the sort of anarchist arrangement, but for public choice reasons, you're going to start getting stuff that libertarians don't want back in. So I guess my point here is that's not a unique concern about a UBI. I think that's just a concern about the way government grows. And so I do think, I'm sort of sympathetic to Brian's point that he made right there at the end, which is like, this is not what we should be advocating. So I think in terms of marketing, that's probably correct, because what we will not get is the UBI replacing the status quo. It's like, we'll get the UBI and then pieces of the status quo will remain or come back, that sort of thing. But here again, I would say that's an issue of marketing or rhetoric. Whereas the truth is, like, if we could replace it and it stuck as a UBI and some of the status quo didn't grow back, would that be good? I'd say that would be an improvement. That would be an improvement.
Brian, anything on that?
Yep. And so what I would just say is, think about this. So you've got a pile of government money where they got $4 trillion. All right. And now the question is how to spend it. How are we going to go and spend this money? Or we can't just give it back to people. We're going to spend it on something. And I would say that if you could either go and give every American an equal cut, or you could go and spend it in the way that we currently do, it's better to spend it in the way that we currently do. We spend a lot of money on really crazy and ridiculous stuff, such as subsidizing higher education. And yet, when you go and compare the sheer folly of giving everyone an equal amount to at least having some targeting to some groups that are either more in need or will have lower work incentives, the system is not as bad as possible, and it's better than simply giving people equal amounts. So the status quo, obviously be a lot better. We could have much better targeting. We could really do effective altruism, but that's not going to happen. But I'll still say that the status quo is better than giving equal amounts to everybody, because as dumb as status quo is, at least there is some connection to both the amount of good that you can do, as well as, so a positive connection, amount of good that you can do, and a negative connection to who actually will respond to, let's see, what's the right way, to the incentives. We do to wind up giving a lot more money to people whose incentives will not be affected very much by the money.
Great, thanks. I'm going to come now to Barry with a question.
Thanks very much. Been really fascinating listening to you. Some 26 years ago, I was sitting next to a young chap called Matt Zwolinski, in a classroom in Arizona, listening to Philip Van Parijs talking about unconditional basic income. My take at the time was very much along the lines of Brian, and I sort of argued that the actual wealth required for a basic income was basically to depend upon the conditionality that you see in a sort of market-based society. However, I've actually becoming more and more sympathetic towards the UBI approach, simply because looking at the sort of structures of government, of its take and so on, but you scoff at the sort of 70% tax take and so that. Well, if you start looking at how much you pay in direct tax out of your salary, and then start to calculate the indirect taxes that you pay on top of that from your net tax sort of position, you start to get well above 50%. Certainly in Britain, we're well above that. And so you're kind of getting there already. So there's a situation where you are seeing a huge amount of tax taken out. Secondly, you've got the huge amounts of corporate subsidies that go on and transfers from poorer people to rich corporations. Those perhaps ought to be cut out and channeled in the appropriate fashion. So there's a fiscal transfer issue there that's going on, but I think there's also a question about norms, and you see this in Denmark, where you've got a very generous unemployment structure, unemployment insurance, with a very high percentage of the amount that you were earning being paid in unemployment benefit. The norm is people work, and yet you have sort of a very low unemployment rate within Denmark, certainly comparable to some of the lowest in the US states. So I think there's an issue here that it's not just about sort of the structures, it's also about the norms and behaviors and customs involved. And I think that libertarians, if they're trying to push a reform through, ought to be looking at what actually works and what should be sustainable in working, because in order to get a change through, it's going to take an awful lot of argument, of coalition building, and then to maintain it after that. So if we are going to do one kind of major reform, this might be it. And so that's where I sort of coming down more and more towards the UBI as an approach.
All right. So I think that your first instinct was correct. In terms of the numbers, it's true you can definitely find individuals when you pile all the taxes on, they've got a marginal tax rate of 70%. But still, if you look at virtually any first world country, none of them have a government spending to GDP ratio or tax to GDP ratio, anything like that. And you would actually need to get something like a tax to GDP ratio of 70% in order to go and fund a UBI at the level that a normal person would think is acceptable to make sure that no one is suffering serious poverty. In terms of the share of government spending that's going to corporations, look, this is one thing where you can get really worked up over how disgusting it is that a rich corporation is getting money. But in terms of the percentage of GDP that's going to it, it is quite low. Normally, the only thing that absorbing even a few percent of GDP would be agricultural subsidies in your most profligate subsidizers of agriculture, like France, I believe. So, it's like we said, gave them $10 billion, which divided by GDP is almost nothing. So, it is one where we just don't have much in the way of savings to get from cutting taxpayer subsidies to corporations. By the way, so Chris did not make another really popular libertarian argument, which is crazy, namely, which is good for Chris. This is just, we're wasting so much on the paperwork, that would fund it. It's like, no. The paperwork costs are not maybe 1% of all this. It's nothing nearly enough. And guess what? We get something for that paperwork. We get not giving money to some people. When you have to fill out paperwork, this means that some people are ineligible and some people don't bother. And so we save money that way too.
Chris, anything on this? Okay, we've got to go to another question from the chat. Paul is asking about fraud in each case. I'm curious if either of you want to argue that there will be less fraud either with the status quo or with a UBI than we would get if we made that change.
Yeah, probably less fraud with the UBI, just like I said, because if everybody's eligible, you don't need to lie. However,
well, sorry, I'll just say you could then lie about income, right, and not report back. Maybe
well,
there'd be more under the
that's
table
one where
work.
we already have a full income tax system set up to go and have documentation about earned income. That's why, there's this idea of, well, we just take people's word for it on their income, and for some things, yes, but for your gross income, no. There's a document sent to you, one sent to the government, and then if your document doesn't match the one that the business independently sent the government, then you are going to have some splaining to do.
Yeah, I imagine there would be slightly less fraud with the UBI, but it's not clear to me. I don't think that moves the needle a whole lot in either direction.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
I mean, a lot of times with the argument, it's more of the emotional weight of the argument than the actual quantitative value of it, which I think another reason to be super distrustful. Because someone says, "Oh, there's all this wasteful paperwork. Rich corporations are getting the money," and then we get rid of fraud. It's like, okay, well, we go and we crunch the numbers on each of these are rounding errors, but still, often you can win the debate. And this is why it's really nice to go and debate Chris, because he's not just trying to go and demagogue to the crowd. You can go and give 10 reasons, each of which is a rounding error, but it's like, hey, you have 10 arguments. What's your answer to that stuff? And the answer is, yeah, like, you're right on all 10, but it barely matters. Like, okay, so he's right. And it's like, ah.
Right, thanks. Going to come to Pedram with his hand raised, their hand raised.
Hi. So I wanted to start with that I don't necessarily agree that fraud would decrease. I think it would increase because the attack vector increases, right? So you have like much more attacks happening when SERB and other stuff happening from other countries, especially the more prevalent it is, the more the attack vector, the surface essentially increases. So I think there would be more fraud on that. But my question is, in the long run, if we institute these taxes, like in the very long run, when you think about it, what's to stop from, like, think about it. We just talked about Elon. There's Ilya Sutskever of OpenAI and Arne Karpathy that also developed FSD for Tesla and OpenAI. These all came to Canada. But I come from another background. I come from computer science, and people are very, very competitive here. Like the 50% capital gains tax here essentially pushes everyone to either incorporate in Delaware or find some way to, find another way of doing things. In the long run, wouldn't you think about like companies moving overseas, moving as much assets as they can? Like, for example, Meta, Google, other people put all their patents in Ireland, for example, and do most of their operations outside of the States, do all sorts of things. And at the end of the day, people themselves moving to other places because they can see that they can reinvest all that resources into themselves and out competing everyone else. Like when you think about it, the UAE has some of the best models, is attracting Telegram. I've seen so many people just from Canada moving to UAE. What's to stop in the long run this country from becoming not competitive compared to others and therefore losing out in the long run? Because when you think about it, these have to be instituted on AI companies, like high growth. A lot of things have to be automated. And with the competition moving elsewhere, you lose your resources in order to institute the UBI. Also, on that note, what's to stop governments from essentially bribing the populace with other people's money in order to go up?
Let's see. Let me just do the last question first. What's to stop government from bribing the population with its own money? Nothing. And that's what we have right now. It is worth pointing out, since I work on public opinion, that it is not the case that people are voting for governments because they personally are getting money. Rather, what people are voting for is what they consider fair. You'll see that even very rich people will standardly support high taxes on the rich and helping the poor. Right? So these are things that are just, they sound really good, and this is why they are actually generally done by governments, although there's a lot of hypocrisy mixed in. And as Chris and I know, the welfare state is about, at best, helping the relatively rich people who are in your country, by people who by global standards are relatively rich. And there's no shame about saying that poor international workers can't come, but even so, it's not really about self-interest. It's just about what people think is best for the country. I think the main limit is, despite great voter rationality, most people have the common sense to realize, well, we can't go and just give money to everybody for everything. Well, otherwise, it's going to be a disaster. Even very left-wing people, push comes to shove, all right, fine, there's a limit to what we can do here. There's always people who are so unreasonable that there is no limit in their view. In terms of international tax competition, it's a mild force, but that's all that it is. Because first of all, the rich countries are really nice to be in. You could go and try moving to some small island for tax benefits, but then there's the problem you have to deal with the government of that island. The normal pattern is that capital moves from places where it's scarce to where it's abundant, as Robert Lucas said, which is, it's like, well, wouldn't that happen? Like, no, actually, you would think that if you had capital, you want to go and take it to some place where there's hardly any capital, and then you get a high return. But in practice, it seems like capital does the best in places where there's a lot of capital. The places in the world that get almost no international investment would be the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, even though you might think there'd be a gain there. But those countries are so screwed up in so many other ways that the net on balance is, no, I don't want to put my money there and just throw the dice.
And also, I'll briefly reiterate. So, maybe my proposal is, well, I think it's probably too radical to actually be accepted. But my view is, I don't want to raise taxes. I just want to take what we currently have and convert it to a UBI. So maybe this is not enough. But I mean, I agree. I don't want super high tax rates either. So for me, it's maybe the way to put it is, it's a qualitative question. So what is the quality of the redistribution that we should undertake? And so we could have a further discussion about taxes, but I want to sort of hold that fixed for the moment and then talk about what we can do within that constraint.
Hey, Chris, let me just ask you one question. All right. So you got this pile of government money that can spend on people. It really doesn't make sense to you that we should go and prioritize kids and the elderly versus working age people?
Yeah. Well, so here, I suppose this is, how we could get redistribution to ideally work versus maybe how it actually works. So yeah, so if I'm the benevolent despot, I would say, yeah, let's identify like children who are in need. Let's identify adults who are unable to work, and really get sort of fine-grained distinctions here and send money in those ways. Now, I think that would be ideal. But I think again,
how about crude distinctions versus none? UBI is none. What we got right now is crude. It's not a good system at all, but at least it isn't equal for everyone. It's like, all right, kids get more. It's like, well, not all kids are needy, true, fine, but blah, blah, blah. And then elderly get more, not elderly needy, fine. But like just giving it equally to everyone, that's not just, not perfect. It just seems crazy.
Well, but so we do draw distinctions with the UBI because of the tax end. So only, on its face,
only for income, not based upon other observable characteristics that are strong predictors of ability to self-support.
Right. So that's right. So it is just based on income, but it would be progressive. And so again, take Social Security. I mean, that's money that's going to some of the wealthiest people in the country. And it's also again, compared to a system of private retirement. So we say, again, abolish Social Security, give people cash, let them invest. The average American is going to be much richer as a result of that change than they would have as a result of keeping Social Security.
After a generation or two.
Yeah, so here we go. So we gotta phase it out, and that's gonna be true. So here again, if I were running for president and trying to win, like heaven forbid this scenario comes, whatever for president, that would be tricky. But as a philosopher, as a theorist, I would say, look, this would be an improvement, but perhaps we cannot actually get the improvement because it's politically infeasible. So I would agree with that claim that it's not feasible.
The question from our chat. One argument I've sometimes heard for UBI is that would allow for more entrepreneurship because the risk of going into business and failing would be sort of minimized or mitigated. Kent actually asks if removing the possibility of failure would sort of diminish the free enterprise system, which got me thinking, would we have too many businesses we didn't want? Would that cupcake store that doesn't make any money, but basically breaks even, stay in business because the owner was actually using the UBI system? Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, there's a lot of romanticization of small business. And among a certain kind of libertarian like your agorist, there is even this idea of the only reason why we have big corporations is some kind of act of government. And under libertarianism, we would all be self-employed or almost all be self-employed. So all this stuff is wrong. The truth is that most people are just not competent to run their own business. They would be terrified to do it. And if you put them in charge, they would just do a really bad job. It's a very sensible for most people to be employed by somebody else who just tells them, okay, this is your part of what the team does, and then they don't have to figure out what the market is or take responsibility. And most people don't want it and wouldn't be good at it. So insofar as your argument for the UBIs, we get more small businesses, that'd be great. Not so great. You think about this. If your friend says, oh, I'm going to start my own small business, like your normal reaction is, yeah, that sounds like a really bad idea. Definitely if it's a restaurant, I'm going to start a restaurant. And then it's like, so, well, 80% failure rate in the first year, why won't you be in the 80%? Sometimes people have a story that's so great, it's like, all right, I take it back. But normally it's like, yeah, like, I don't think that's a good idea at all.
And also, if you do think your friend's cupcake idea is great, you could always invest 10 grand if you're very, this is like put your money where your mouth is sort of thing. But yeah, so I mean, maybe on the margin it would increase like entrepreneurial activity, but I wouldn't want to put a whole lot of weight on that myself.
All right, thanks. Going to come to
Yeah,
Timur
I mean,
now.
actually, I'd say the main way in which I think the UBI would actually increase entrepreneurship would be the tax rates would be so high that people would want to become self-employed so they could hide income more effectively.
Cupcake business, but it's cash only or Bitcoin
Yeah,
only.
yeah, the cash cupcake business. It's awesome.
Timur.
Hey, can you guys hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. This question is for Chris. To me, it seems that, I don't know, maybe Chris has a different answer, but the ideal form of charity would be like a church or a community group where basically, let's say somebody comes to them and be like, hey, I'm pregnant, I don't have money, or I'm addicted to drugs, or some kind of help that people need that would be targeted. So your community would administer that help and would check on your progress. And then if you fail, if you're just keep doing drugs or whatever, after a while you just get cut off, or so it's like it's very targeted. And there's also like the society also kind of puts pressure on you because like you don't want to look bad in front of your community or your church or something, things like that. So it seems that UBI, it's going, even though our current method is not ideal, but it's UBI is kind of going away from the ideal charity method. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's interesting. Right. So here again, there's, UBI, the status quo, and then maybe there's a third option, which is better than both. And I'm definitely open to hearing arguments. And yeah, so I think part of what you're getting at here is maybe something about local knowledge, where you know about this particular person, their particular circumstances, what they need, and so on. And if they're a member of your religious congregation, for example, you know what their needs are. You know how they're acting, you can monitor them and so forth. I mean, yeah, so I think in some ways, the status quo is closer to that than a UBI. On the other hand, though, a UBI, so you give somebody cash, then that also opens up philanthropic opportunities for them. So if they know this particular person is in need, they can use their cash. Now, here again, I don't want to put too much weight on that because I'm not convinced tons of people are going to use their UBI for charity, as opposed to personal consumption. I mean, one other thing too that I'll just add. I mean, I would say the system that you're describing, I think has lots of advantages. Although I wouldn't want to sign on to the claim that it's the best form of charity. This relates to a point that Brian was making earlier. So even people who are poor by American standards are rich by global standards. So I'd say the ideal form of charity is the stuff that the effective altruists are doing. So like malaria relief and so on. So charitable efforts that are not actually directed at Americans, but people who are in poverty by global standards.
Right. And just to add, contrary to at least some libertarians, the idea that you could support anything remotely close to a modern welfare state using voluntary charity is absurd. The math is just nowhere there. There's no country in history I've ever heard of where people voluntarily give 10% of their money away. There's countries where they're like, there's religious tithing, but like that's the theory. It's not that everybody's actually doing that. Now that I still support welfare state abolition because I think that the welfare state is profligate. It is way too fast and loose. It makes it way too easy to get money. I think that private charity could support an extremely stringent, austere, means-tested alternative to the welfare state. So that's realistic, but it's essentially the opposite of UBI. It's one where they look at you and say, like, convince me that you have a problem that no way you could have solved on your own. And then if you can't, it's like, yeah, well, I only have the money to help people who have problems. They're like horrible problems through no fault of their own. And other than that, we just don't have the money.
Thanks. Going to come back to the chat. Don has a question sort of relating to the fact that during the Freedom Convoy, which I think is today is like the second anniversary, the big trucker protest in Ottawa, and some of the people who donated to that had their bank accounts frozen as a result of sort of federal government actions. So Don is concerned that even though it's in theory a universal income, perhaps it becomes a bit of a social credit thing where people who do things the government doesn't like are no longer eligible. Chris, does this scare you as something that might happen?
First of all, I don't remember this convoy. I don't pay attention to Canadian news. I don't really pay attention to American news either, but I definitely don't pay attention. I mean, maybe, but so I'm not sure if the worry would be significantly more pronounced in the case of a UBI than the status quo, because if the thought is the government's, out to punish you and withholding certain benefit, could do that with the status quo too. Like maybe it's easier with the UBI, but here again, this is one of those things like, yeah, like I could see it being different on the margins, but I don't think it moves the needle one way or the other for me.
Brian, anything?
Yep. Great.
Right. Chris.
It is the question for Chris. So this is a debate about what's preferable to you. And you were just kind of talking about this. What's preferable to you?
Can't hear you. Cannot hear.
How about now?
Maybe.
Oh, now I can hear you.
Okay. The question to Chris is, what do you think is preferable? A UBI, a well-functioning UBI, the way you would want it, or something more like traditional libertarianism, fully austere, cut all government benefits to the bone and replace them with nothing?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So let me back up a little bit to give you some more context. So I don't think I'm a taxation is theft libertarian. Maybe this is another dialogue Brian and I have to have at some point. But so I'm a consequentialist libertarian, and so I like libertarianism because I think it gives us the best consequences. So that's how I would try to answer this question: is would we end up having better consequences if we just had the contemporary welfare state like replaced with nothing? I mean, so I'm gonna be a little bit evasive here. So here's the way I think about this question is it depends on if we're talking about holding everything else fixed and simply replacing the status quo with nothing, or are we thinking about something like an ideal libertarian society? So if the world or the United States became libertarian in all respects, and then we just had this one question: do we still want a UBI or do we want nothing? I think, well, like, I don't know, like it strikes me as pretty plausible. You get rid of all the ways in which the state interferes with productive private enterprise. You deregulate housing, you open the border, you have free trade, you get rid of occupational licensing, so on down the line. That is a very, very prosperous society. And that's a society which probably doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of poverty. Now, it would have some, and this goes back to the charity case. So, I think the interesting thing is, would that society be rich enough? Would there be few enough people in poverty that those cases could be addressed without a UBI? And the reason I say I'm going to be evasive is because I don't know. I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that it would be rich enough that, private charity would be adequate, but that's speculation on my part. So I'm not going to be able to give you a super clear answer. So I'm open to the idea. Now, in this question, in the current world, where it's not libertarian, we have all these ways in which the state is making people worse off. It's exacerbating poverty. And I say, yeah, maybe not so much with getting rid of redistribution entirely. But it's a lot of conjecture at this point.
Yeah, and I'd say that's a big difference. So I'm always for cutting government spending, and this stuff is, I think, on net really bad. Yes, we have a bunch of bad policies, but these are additional bad policies. I don't think that they really do much to offset the harm of the status quo policies. They just add to it. I do agree that it would look terrible in the news to get rid of the welfare state. There is a limit to how much they can just go and constantly bombard people with horror stories, but it's a pretty high limit. So if people listen to me, I think almost everyone would say that Bryan's idea was a failure, and I would say, no, it's not a failure. It just looks bad on the news. But if we go and actually calm down and look at the overall effects, it's actually really good. So consequentialists who really mean it like Chris should still be happy and agree with me. But the normal kind of consequentialist, which is the consequence of what's in the newspaper or what's on TV, which is actual consequentialism, is I don't want to be upset by stories. Those people are going to say it was a disaster. But I'm going to stand by this so-called disaster.
Got a macroeconomic question in the chat, which I'm going to direct to Bryan. First of all, is inflation a concern? Is that one of the reasons that we might not want a UBI?
The main issue is just how are you going to fund it and what will the work incentives be? So if you fund it by replacing the current welfare state, and if Chris is right that there's not going to be much change in work incentives, then nothing. I think that even if we did not actually change the total spending, so if demand stayed the same, we didn't print a lot of money to spend it, we just reallocated the budget, I think there'd still be a net negative supply effect, because we would wind up giving worse incentives to people that are working age, and so they would be especially likely to work less. We'd be giving somewhat better incentives to the young and the old, but they're not going to work much more. And so there would be a reduction in supply. So at least you'll get a one-time rise in inflation. No reason for it to be continuous. And anytime you see continuous rises in prices, that's a sign of the one thing that you can just keep adding zeros to and keep getting more of is money, right? You can't keep adding zeros to the amount of corn you're growing. Well, you can lie, but money, on the other hand, you can just print as much as you want. So Zimbabwe can do it. Anybody can.
Right, thanks. Kent, over to you.
Oh, you're muted, Kent.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, this one goes towards Chris. The problem I've always had with consequentialism is that it treats consequences more as foundational in determining obligations and not necessarily in that consequences have no role to play in determining obligations. But when I talked about failure, when I asked about failure, what I was not referring to necessarily was like, oh, there's going to be more small businesses, there's going to be more entrepreneurship. I was talking about more like the elements of the human experience that, like, learning from failure is a big thing, and some people need to hit rock bottom to become the better person that they can become. And to me, that kind of goes hand in hand with free enterprise. It's more the opportunity to try and have a go at it, and then you can either succeed or fail. And so I'm just wondering how, I mean, I'm not saying that we should let people fail and then not be able to try again, but we should have a robust redemption system in place after we allow people to reach the bottom, so to speak, of their enterprise venture.
Yes. So I mean, I think what we want is a system that incentivizes people to take calculated risks. So you don't, so risk taking is not an unmitigated good, because you don't want people taking foolish risks that end up wasting resources. And so, I could see the UBI going either way here. So on the one hand, you might say somebody's like, oh, I got, this goes back to the earlier point, like, oh, like I could take this risk, and maybe it's not starting your own business, but maybe it's starting a new career or moving cross country, something like that. Say, oh, now I have the means to do it because of the UBI. And so maybe that could be good. But on the other hand, you might have somebody who's like, I'm going to take this risk. I haven't thought about, or like the prospects for it aren't great, but I know I have this cushion in the form of the UBI. And so I'm going to do it. And that was a risk we didn't want them to take. So here again, it's going to be different in different cases. Yeah, I think having some sort of safety net so that, that people can take some risks and they don't have to worry that they're going to lose their entire livelihood if things don't go out. I think that's a good idea. But it's going to be an empirical question, sort of the quantity and quality of the safety net that sort of incentivizes calculated risk taking.
Bryan, anything on that?
Yep. Good.
Okay.
Jackson has a question for Bryan. Would like to know what your least bad welfare system would look like.
Great question. I'd say least bad welfare system starts does effective altruism, and we take whatever money we're going to spend and we give it to the poorest, most desperate people on earth, people who could not help themselves. So war orphans, essentially it would be almost all of it would be given to people in other countries, almost none for people here in the US because people in the US are so well off by world standards. It would also be puritanical. It'd be saying, well, so like, did you cause your problem? Like, why is it actually that you have this problem? If you went and caused it, it's like, well, then at least you are way down the queue. We're starting with people who are suffering in absolute terms for no fault of their own. War orphans would be, in my mind, like the canonical example. And then we just keep going and see how far we get with that. So if you run out of money and there's still desperate people saying, well, this is far as much as we got. If you're so rich that you can take care of every war orphan, and then it's all right, well, who's next in line after the war orphans? So I would focus on that. The only other route that I think would be something like giant prizes for just solving incredibly hard, important problems. So a giant prize for figuring out a way to extend human life expectancy by 10 years, give $1 trillion to whoever can pull that off. So that would be something else, which is not maybe the welfare state in conventional terms, but honestly, most of my solution to poverty is open borders, which is not a solution to domestic poverty. It's really only a solution to global poverty, but that's the really severe kind anyway. So that's what we should be focused on. It won't play out well in the news. On the news, they're going to be saying he was already suffering, and now he has to deal with competition from all of these foreigners. And this, before we were totally ignoring these other people, so now we're not, and it's an improvement. Doesn't look like it to normal people, but it is.
Thanks. Chris, do you have anything you want to say there?
No, not much. I mean, I agree. I think if I were the benevolent despot, I would say the money should go overseas to the people who need it. And again, yeah, it's not very politically feasible, but I think that is morally the best form of redistribution.
Right now, are you such a conscientialist, Chris, that you don't care whether or not people are the cause of their own problems?
Well, I mean, so I think it matters for the incentives that you create.
Right.
So you might say something.
That, but if you just have the person who's just the very stubborn alcoholic, so you're not going to change. He's not going to change his behavior, but the reason why he has these problems is because of his behavior. It doesn't matter even at the margin for you if there's someone else who is doing just as badly, but he did everything right and just things worked out poorly for him.
And we're bracketing off worries about incentives, all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. So this might take us down a road we don't want to go down, but depending on my mood, I maybe am a moral responsibility skeptic. I waffle on that, but it doesn't.
Is it my fault if I'm not a consequentialist?
No, you're wrong, but it's not your fault.
The conclusive art. Yeah. Well, am I morally vicious for having spurned the revelation?
Well, so you might act in a morally bad way, but it's not ultimately your fault.
Okay. So I can do whatever I want then.
No, I can still criticize it's the wrong decision, but in terms of ultimate responsibility, I'll let you off the hook. Maybe, like I said, it depends on my mood.
Okay.
All right, thanks, guys. We are coming up on time. I'm going to pull one more question from the chat, and then we'll give each a couple of minutes for closing final thoughts. This one's directed to Chris. UBI seems to be very popular. Bryan is opposed it, but Bryan likes lots of things and opposes lots of things that are totally different from what is popular, what most people think. Chris, do you have a public choice theory on why we don't have a UBI? Isn't this something that should be immensely popular with the public and should be implemented, even if Bryan's objections are correct?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, so one issue is, I think, so let's go. So, one of the points of contention is, could we get rid of Social Security as part of the UBI transformation? And again, in terms of political feasibility, probably not, because people who receive Social Security really like it, and people who are, who worked all their life are counting on Social Security. I think it'd be very hard to do. Um, and I also, so I think maybe also that's sort of public choicey, I guess. So you have like wealthy, they vote a lot. They have like, I think the AARP does a decent amount of lobbying. So I think like that, provides part of the explanation for why we're not going to get a UBI as a replacement for something like Social Security. The other thing too, and this is a point that Bryan has been making, is in terms of a politically feasible UBI, what we're probably looking at is not what I'm proposing, the wholesale replacement of the status quo with the UBI. It's like, no, we're layering the UBI on top of other stuff because it's not going to look good on the news if we start saying we're abolishing Social Security, all this stuff. And so I think in the real world, the sort of UBI we would look at is then going to start to be really expensive. And I think that is going to generate some sort of pushback. It's not like a sophisticated public choice theory, but I do think that there are like pretty compelling reasons as to like public choice reasons why we don't have something like a UBI as a replacement for the status quo. It's like people like the status quo, and they like it enough that they want to keep it and just layer the UBI on top of it instead of getting rid of it entirely.
Yeah, this is a great and original question. I don't think I've ever heard the question before, so I always like it when that happens. Um, I am very much of the mind that the status quo is popular and popular things tend to happen. And I think it's also correct that when you just go and give people the quick version of the UBI, they like the idea. However, in order for something to actually go through the political process, you have to consider what will people think after they experience some political pushback. And the arguments against the UBI, fortunately, are pretty simple and very persuasive. So things like it's dumb to go and give a pile of money to rich people and poor people. I think that will really resonate. I think also just the idea that it's not fair that someone could go and get money and be supported by taxpayers for life when to surf. I think that would resonate very strongly with people. I think that this is actually a case where public opinion is at least not terrible compared to what it could be, such that they hear a good idea, but then there's some reasonable objections. And in the end, they're like, okay, I guess it's not such a good idea after all. UBI, I think actually, Chris and I almost agree on it, but I guess we got our closing statements. So let me hold for that.
Great. We have about 10 minutes left, so I can ask you just to take 3 or 4 minutes. We started with Chris. I'm going to say Chris can go first on the closing statement. That gives Bryan the last word.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if I have a whole lot to add to what's already been said. And again, I guess in terms of offering an olive branch, maybe I shouldn't be publicly advocating for the UB. Maybe I should take a page out of Milton Friedman's book and just give it up, because what I want is not what we will actually get. And I think that's fair. Like I think that is a fair criticism. So again, if people listen to, so that my response to that is that people just don't listen to me. So it's harmless if I advocate for a UBI, because it's not actually as though people are going to be persuaded by my argument, run with it, and then create meaningful political change. But I would want to just draw this distinction again between maybe how to market something or what sort of arguments we want to make and how people will run with those arguments versus like what the ideal or what an improvement would actually be, whether or not we can get it. So I'm willing to say maybe we shouldn't advocate for it, knowing how it's going to be maybe distorted in the real world. But again, the question would be, if we could get that, would that be an improvement? And again, I think it is for the sorts of reasons that I've given. So I think from the perspective of the recipients, it's a better deal. I think if we keep taxes more or less the same, there's not a whole lot of reason for taxpayers to complain. I guess one other thing too that I don't think I've mentioned a whole lot, but is maybe worth thinking about, would be the ways in which the status quo, I think, is maybe actively bad. So for example, so we talked about how the returns you're going to get from Social Security are going to be a lot lower than you could get if you just kept the money and invested in a retirement account yourself. I think that's one way in which the UBI would be an improvement. But I also think you take a look at something like Medicare and price controls for Medicare. Like there's reason to think that could actually be very harmful over the long term. For example, it might chill pharmaceutical innovation. So there's some work done on that. And so you might say, replacing Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security with cash is going to have costs, but it's also going to have benefits simply in virtue of removing some of the harms created by those policies. So if we just say you get $13,000 and maybe we mandate that you have to spend $3,000 of it on health insurance, I could be persuaded into that. I think that one reason to think that that's going to be improvement over the status quo is simply that the status quo itself can create a lot of harms that wouldn't exist if we switch to a cash-only system. But I'll leave it at that.
Over to you, Brian.
Chris and I agree that the status quo is bad. Where we disagree is whether he's got something that is an improvement over that bad system. So I say that Chris's idea, which is one of the best UBIs I know of, actually, but Chris's version of the UBI is, in my view, worse than what we currently have. In particular, there are two main things to focus on. First of all, it is a worse way to spend the government money in order to go and help the world. So you've got this pile of government money. You've already raised the taxes. You're going to figure out how to spend it. And Chris's proposal is that we go and we give equal amounts to everybody, regardless of circumstances. And I know there's already the tax side, but that's already factored out. So I think that as crummy as the system is, the crude targeting that we have is better than no targeting at all. It would be much better to have very finely grained targeting, but to say that there are some rich kids, there's some rich elderly, so it doesn't make sense to give more money to kids and the elderly is wrong. Kids, on average, are poorer. An elderly without redistribution would be poorer. So that's the first part. Is just it is a bad way to go and spend the money in order to do the most good. So on effective altruism terms, the UBI is a bad idea. Secondly, in terms of work disincentives, it is worse. So even if we're not talking about raising any taxes or anything else, it still is better if the redistribution is going to people who have what economists call low labor supply elasticity. In other words, who are unlikely to change their behavior when they receive redistribution. Two groups that are very unlikely to change their behavior much when you redistribute to them are kids and the elderly. So in that case, we are getting less distortion from the status quo, whereas with Chris, we would wind up having a system where there's a lot of very able-bodied people who then say, hey, fine, I can go and get this money. I don't need to work anymore. And it's not going to be balanced out by the better incentives of kids and the elderly, precisely because they are not in a position to contribute very much anyway. So I will leave it there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to both of you for a great discussion. Chris, you must be a great debate partner. The last time we had a debate with you, your interlocutor came up to me after and said, that was really good. He was much better than I was expecting. I don't know if that says much about expectations or about your performance.
I don't know why I don't remember who that was, but I am a little insulted, but that's okay. That's all right. I've got thick skin.
Chris was as good as I expected because I know Chris, and Chris is
well. Thank you, and likewise.
Good,
yeah, it was a pleasure to do this debate. I mean, I think it's kind of nice to have a dialogue with Brian about this because it's rare that I get to talk to him about something that I think he's wrong about. Like I can count on my one hand, how many things I think he's wrong about.
Thanks so much to both of you for taking the time. Thanks to all of you who showed up. We had a great turnout today, great discussion, more questions than we could get to. Just a quick moment to remind those who are here that if you would like to enter our book draw, that will be open for another hour or so. The link is in the chat. Click on that. And also, we will be back in 2 weeks, Friday, March 1st. We're talking to Niels Carlson, a Swedish professor and classical liberal, about the tensions between classical liberalism and populism in the world. Sign up is available in a link I've posted in the chat. You can also find that information. Will be on our website soon and coming out in future emails. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. I hope to see you in a couple of weeks for our discussion on classical liberalism and populism. And one final thank you to our speakers, our debaters, Brian and Chris. It was a pleasure, guys.
Thank you. And a lot of thanks to you, Matt, and to the Institute for Liberal Studies. Canada needs a lot of help. So what was it? Stay the course. Stay the course.
We're doing what we can. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Thanks.
Right. Bye-bye, everyone.